Hi, welcome back to Space Thoughts. I'm dropping another video midweek again because some interesting developments have occurred over the past couple days, specifically relating to the executive order that came down on April 6th regarding space resources from the White House. There's this institute called the Vancouver Institute in Canada, and last March they met to talk about the idea of space mining, and probably in anticipation of a U.S. position, and basically outline their own position on the idea of space resources and space mining. Now, I'm going to jump over to the document real quickly in a moment here, but I want you to understand this is a direct opposite of what the executive order dropped by the White House on April 6th was intended to do. And I'm going to go through the document a little bit and try and explain some of what's going on. I'm not going to try not to make it too long because it's, obviously we all have other things to do. But like I said, this is very important. I'm just going to jump right over to the document now. Okay, fundamentally, this is it. This dropped on April 20th, a couple days ago, and basically it starts with a preamble about the development of outer space and science and such. But interestingly, at the bottom of page 1, it jumps right into the existing regime for space governance is poorly equipped for these developments. In other words, the outer space development, the possibility, the idea of mining, space mining, and such. And it goes right into that. For example, Article 2 of the 1967 Outer Space Treaty states that outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies, is not subject to national appropriation by claim of sovereignty, by means or of use or occupation by other means. However, it does not say anything about the recovery and use of space resources. And this is the gap that was basically used in 2015 to create the space resource law that is at issue right now. And it goes on to say the absence of clear international rules could pose problems as space mining companies emerge in multiple countries and governments adopt national legislation to support and regulation. It is possible that flags of convenient states will emerge in this field, seeking to attract business through lax regulatory regimes and oversights. And this is one of the big things that that comes out of this is that citizens from other countries might come to countries like the United States that have space resources law to open up companies to actually perform space resource activities if their country of origin doesn't recognize that right. So this is basically what this is addressing right here. This next paragraph is very interesting and one that I find highly contentious and one that I've had a lot of problems with, especially with the building blocks. An updated international legal regime for space governance could ensure that the scientific opportunities presented by space mining are fulfilled, for instance, by requiring that companies make unaltered material available to scientists. In other words, they are looking for a new international body to govern this whole idea of space mining. And this is a theme that I've seen reoccurring, especially in the building blocks. Now, when I talk about the building blocks, like I said, I was invited to be an observer, and I had a chance to comment on the draft, the final drafts of it, and I had some concerns with it. And one of these things was this idea of creating a new international regime. And one of the issues I brought up said, okay, what is your treaty? You're basically saying we need a new treaty, and I got a lot of pushback from members of the working group saying no, we don't need a new treaty. So my question is, how do you create an international legal regime without having a legally binding treaty, agreement, understanding, whatever? And the answer is you don't. So bottom line is my question that I really pressed forward was, okay, if you don't need a new treaty, are you going to use an existing one? And this is where I pointed back to the Moon Agreement, because, and I believe it's Article 11 of the Moon Agreement specifically calls for the creation of an international legal regime. And I mentioned this quite prolifically in my comments to the building blocks. Now, interestingly, the idea behind the executive order on August 6th, it pushes back against the idea of the Moon Agreement very strongly, saying we don't recognize it as a binding treaty, and we don't recognize it as customary international law. So this idea of and I'll go side by side here right now, of an updated international regime means we need a new treaty to address space mining, or we need an amendment to the Outer Space Treaty, which isn't going to happen. It's just politically, it's just not going to happen. I mean, as much as people talk about amending the Outer Space Treaty, and even though there are provisions for updating the Outer Space Treaty, it's not going to happen. So bottom line is, the idea is there's a call for an international regime. It's going to need a new treaty, and or it's going to have to use an existing treaty. And this is where the Moon Agreement comes in, and hence in my opinion, one of the reasons for the pushback in the executive order on April 6th. There was, in March 2020, 2 dozen experts convened at Peter Wall Institute for Advanced Studies at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, hence the Vancouver recommendations on space mining. We'll go right into these a little bit. They apply to all space mining activities, whether carried out by governmental agencies or non-governmental agencies. This is where I have a little bit of a problem with it, because specifically in the April 6th order, it basically addresses the idea of commercial, private space resource activities. This is actually looking at both, and this was actually a theme in the building blocks as well. The term of one of the other issues I had was the definition of what they call an operator also included governmental agencies and international agencies of international bodies as well. And I was really under the impression that, in my opinion, that was considered appropriation under Article 2. And right here, I mean, this is again reiterating what, in my opinion, what the building blocks are saying is, you know what, we're going to make this available to governments as well. And I dropped an article in Space News basically addressing this issue, basically with relation to the People's Republic of China, whereas companies are basically state-owned enterprises, and if private industry from China participated in space resource activities, implicitly that would be involving a sovereign body as well, in my opinion, against the idea of non-appropriation in Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty. It says here, we acknowledge the legal debate over Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty. We do not take a position on the debate, apart from noting that contested interpretations of international law cannot become binding unless accepted by a significant majority of states. Yes and no. It depends on what states are actually, are basically going and saying, basically alluding to that. In other words, are these states that are agreeing to it, are they considered major spacefaring nations? Are they actively participating in it? Are they big players? And that's one of the problems with the Moon Agreement. I mean, there's 18 players in the Moon Agreement, but they're not part of the real major spacefaring nations, or what's considered the spacefaring nations. That's one of the idiosyncrasies about customary international law. And if you go back to my video that I did a few weeks ago on customary international law, I discuss about what I call, the juice, or having the juice to make customary international law. And I guess this basically, my comment to this one is basically that this is the same thing here. A lot of countries may rail against the idea of space resources that the U.S. is putting forth, but do they really have the juice to make customary international law? We consider the unilateral adoption of national legislation to be an inadequate response to the need to ensure that space mining, wherever and whenever it occurs, does so in a safe and sustainable manner. And again, this goes back to the argument of bottom up. In other words, creating international law based on national law and having it trickle up, or top-down measures, which these recommendations are basically talking about through treaties or multilateral bodies. That's what number 3 is basically talking about. 4, we recommend multilateral negotiations on an international regime for space mining. The mandate of the negotiation should be to support safe and sustainable space mining. And this gets back to my criticism of the building blocks. I asked, my comment was, well, there's got to be a new, you're going to need a new treaty, and I got a basic flat-off denial. No, we don't need a new treaty. And that gets back to my discussion about, the Moon Agreement. The negotiation should be open to all states, non-spacefaring states, and developing states should be incentivized to develop or acquire the expertise helpful for effective participation in the negotiations. This is a lot of talk. This language sounds very familiar to me from UNCLOS, the UN Convention on Law of the Sea, basically about enabling other nations to participate. And again, this is a pushback from the U.S. approach. We're going to do it outside of international bodies and engage states one-on-one, and basically invite them to come in and discuss it. This wants to take what I call the top-down approach, and actually, negotiate a treaty, include everybody, get everybody's opinion, and have a lot of cooks. Options for initiating negotiations may include, but not are limited to, a United Nations General Assembly resolution, a meeting of state parties to the Outer Space Treaty, and the activation of Article 18 of the Moon Agreement by states parties to that treaty or ad hoc process. There you go, the Moon Agreement. And this goes back to my assertion in my comments in the building blocks. Guys, you're talking about the Moon Agreement. And here they're talking about activating Article 18 of the Moon Agreement to bring it into play. In other words, to legitimize it. But the U.S., in the April 6th executive order basically said, we don't recognize it, plain and simple. And we're going to basically denounce it as customary international law. Here they're basically actively trying to invoke the Moon Agreement and give it legitimacy in the body of international law. And I think that's a very how can you say, open comment that we believe the Moon Agreement is legitimate international law and binding international law, even though it only has 18 states that are basically parties to it, and none of the big three are. That means the U.S., the Russian Federation, and the People's Republic of China. And number 7 goes into, and basically, negotiating states should consider the creation of international governance mechanisms, consider the establishment of an international body, be guided by the precautionary principle. I'm going to let you read all three through these because basically I'm going to put a link to these afterwards. But bottom line is, what they're basically doing is they are calling for a international body. They're talking for a top-down approach versus the bottom approach that the April 6th executive order basically calls for. There's one other quick thing I want to mention, and I saw it in here someplace. Essentially, it's in here. I can't find it right off in here, but basically they come right out and say that space is a global commons. And the April 6th executive order basically comes out and says, no, it's not. And this is basically the two positions that are going to be facing off. The side that doesn't believe outer space is a global commons, and the side that does believe space is a global commons. I'm not going to get into discussion into what the global commons is in this video because it's long, and I'm going to try and do it in a way that you can understand the way I look at why space is a global commons, my perception of it, versus an academic, scholarly, and something you can understand and such. Maybe I'll do that in a later video. Maybe this weekend if I'm not too busy. Maybe in the next couple of weeks I will do that. But this is a quick video about this. This is extremely significant because this is a direct pushback to the April 6th 2020 White House executive order on space resources. This takes a completely polar opposite position on the idea of space resources. This directly supports the building blocks, and interesting because I had a colleague basically tell me that when I mentioned that the building blocks that the executive order basically pushed back against building blocks, the response was no, it doesn't. The mention of the building blocks in here as a model or basically representative of what we should be doing basically tells me this is basically the April 6th order is a pushback against the building blocks as well as the Moon Agreement. Again, I want to keep this short because we all have other things to do. It's a good day out. Oh, and just one other quick announcement. A good colleague of mine basically sent me the English version of the United Emirates domestic space law, which actually includes a provision for space mining similar to the U.S. And I may talk about that in another video upcoming. I'm definitely going to be writing about it probably in the next few weeks. But that's a very significant development. We've been waiting a long time for that to drop publicly, and now it has. So again, have a great day. I want you to stay healthy. I want you to stay safe as we all go through this in our own way. So anyways, have a great day, and we'll talk to you next time.